Greetings, esteemed commissioners. It is my honor and privilege to appear before you today and to testify before this commission on police violence in the United States as it affects Black people and Black communities. My name is Andrea Ritchie. I am a researcher at the Interrupting Criminalization Initiative at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'm also the author of Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, chronicling over 4 centuries of state violence against Black women, girls, queer, and trans people in the United States, and have spent the last 2.5 decades researching, writing, organizing, litigating, advocating, and agitating around police violence against Black women, girls, LGBT people, and communities in the United States. I'm also a member of the Movement for Black Lives Policy Table and a former Soros Justice Fellow. I also am a Black woman, a lesbian, an immigrant, and a survivor of state and interpersonal violence. Information I share because they may not be apparent from looking at me, but also because these identities have deeply informed the work that I do. I'm here before you today because though you are hearing testimony about many cases of police violence in the United States, each of them horrific, all of them demanding action, there are many that you may not be hearing about today. For instance, you may hear about the killing of Mike Brown, which sparked the Ferguson uprising and the most recent iteration of the movement against police violence in the United States, but you may not hear about Michelle Cusseau, a Black woman who was killed by Phoenix police just a few days after Mike Brown was, a Black lesbian who was in her home to whom police were responding in response to a call for help, and who instead killed her within seconds of attempting to break down her door. You may also have you will be hearing about Eric Garner, but you may not hear about Tanisha Anderson, a Cleveland young woman who was killed by police who again were responding to a call for assistance just a few months after Eric Garner died. She also died on the pavement on the street in front of her house as police officers tried to force her into custody, much as they did Eric Garner. You will be hearing testimony about Freddie Gray, but you may not hear testimony about Maya Hall, a Black trans woman who was killed at a security checkpoint just outside of Baltimore just weeks before Freddie Gray's murder by the Baltimore Police Department set off the uprising in that city. In her case, simply because she took a wrong turn, which many of us have taken off the highway. I myself have made this wrong turn, but it takes you onto national security property. And unlike the white supremacists who rioted and attacked and stormed the Capitol in an attempted coup last week, who experienced very few consequences for their actions, Maya Hall was immediately perceived to be a terrorist threat for simply making a wrong turn onto federal property and was shot and killed as a result. You may hear testimony about Kayla Moore, a Black trans woman who was killed by police in her own home, again in response to a call for assistance with from a housemate about a perceived mental health crisis. When the officers arrived, they ran Kayla's name using her dead name, her birth name, came up with a warrant for someone who was 20 years older than her that shared the name she had been assigned at birth, and proceeded to attempt to take her into custody under the warrant. And when Kayla said, "There's no warrant out for my arrest, let's call the FBI and check," they tackled her to the ground and suffocated her to death in her own home, and later refused to offer her medical assistance because she was trans and referred to her as it as she was laying on the ground dying. You may not hear about Kayla's family's ongoing struggle for justice in her case, where they are fighting for a mental health response that does not involve armed police officers who can take actions in the way that they did that take Kayla's life. They're fighting for that response to be available 24 hours a day and not just during limited business hours, which do not limit the times during which people are or are perceived to be in a mental health crisis. And they're fighting for justice for Black trans women killed and harmed by police across the country. You may not hear about the case of Rakia Boyd, a young Black woman killed by a police officer in her own neighborhood in Chicago in 2012, whose struggle sparked not only a massive movement led by groups in Chicago like BYP 100, Assata's Daughters, Love and Protect, We Charge Genocide, and so many more. Let Us Breathe Collective demanding justice in her case, and young Black women who continue to organize in her name and in her legacy from A Long Walk Home, whose movements also used the hashtag Say Her Name and sparked nationwide days of action 3 years in a row to end state violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. And finally, you will hear about George Floyd, who was choked to death by police officers on the streets of his hometown. But you may not hear about Frankie Ann Perkins, a Black woman who was also choked to death by police officers on the streets of her neighborhood because they believed that she had swallowed drugs, and in an attempt to get her to cough them up, choked her to death. And in the end, no drugs were found on or near her or in her system, but her life was snuffed out in ways very similar to George Floyd's, with people looking on, screaming, demanding that they stop, and in horror and in grief. And so there are hundreds more Black women who have been killed by police who you may not hear about, but who make up very much the story of police violence in this country throughout history, from the first arrival of enslaved African peoples on this land until the present day. And what you may also not hear is that Black women are the group most likely to be killed by police when unarmed of any demographic group. So while the numbers are smaller for Black women by far, the racial disparities are equally, if not more high, and definitely place the lives of Black women at risk in interactions with police in the United States. You will hear about Breonna Taylor's case, of course, which has galvanized so many people to understand Black women's experiences of police violence as equally important to those of Black men and boys in the United States. You will hear about Tarika Wilson's case and Alberta Spruill's, two other women who died, Black women who died in no-knock drug raids. You may not hear about the many more and the larger context of the war on drugs that takes so many Black women's lives, from the age of 7 in the case of Ayanna Stanley Jones to the age of 92 in the case of Katherine Johnson, who also was killed during a police no-knock raid on her home as a 92-year-old grandmother. You also will probably not hear about Black disabled lives taken in the context of the war on drugs, including Lakeisha Turner, who was in her home when police stormed it with flashbang grenades and concussion grenades, and the smoke filled her house, and she was unable, unfortunately, to get out or get down away from the smoke because she uses a wheelchair and was unable to move in that way, and died 3 months later as a result of the inhalation injuries that she experienced in that police raid. And the war on drugs also takes the lives of Black trans women, including Shelley Treasure Hilliard, who was arrested by police on a minor marijuana possession offense, and given the choice of either going to jail, where she faced, as many people know, Black trans women are often placed in jail and prison facilities based on the gender they were assigned at birth, and therefore with men, and face certain verbal harassment and certain physical abuse, and often certain sexual abuse from both people they're incarcerated with and the people incarcerating them. So she was faced with the choice of certain violence in a jail cell or turning on the person who had sold her the marijuana. So she chose to testify, inform on the person who had sold her the marijuana, and the police officers cared so little for her Black trans life that they told the person who sold her the drugs who had informed on them. And days later, Shelley Treasure Hilliard's mother was forced to identify her daughter's remains in pieces spread out over the city of Detroit where she lived, burned, and otherwise disfigured. So there are many ways that Black women like Breonna Taylor have been killed in the context of the war on drugs as part of the way in which that war is waged, as a central aspect of how the war is waged. Even when Black women are not killed and Black trans people are not killed in the context of the war on drugs and raids like the one that killed Breonna Taylor, they experience deep physical violence and humiliation, as was the case for Lisa Hayes, who was in her home in Delaware when police again stormed in on a no-knock warrant drug raid and abused and humiliated her, including ordering her to get up out of a bed, which she was unable to do because she uses a wheelchair, which was parked right next to her bed. And she repeatedly informed them of the ways in which she was disabled, and they repeatedly abused her in that context, in the context of a drug raid. So many people might look at these stories and say, well, Black women, girls, and trans people are merely collateral consequences to the war on drugs. But in fact, Black women and girls are direct targets of the war on drugs. And that happens from in the context of pregnancy, for instance, where Black women are in some states up to 10 times more likely to be tested for drug use when going for prenatal visits or delivering their children than white women, giving rise to what many call giving birth while Black as an analogous experience to driving while Black. And in many cases, Black women who, when drugs are found in their system where they admit to using drugs at the time that they are giving birth, and we're talking here about marijuana or taking a Xanax as a sort of calmative as you're going into labor, which is one of the most painful experiences of any person's life, are immediately arrested on their delivery bed, sometimes even before their placenta is being delivered, separated from their children, taken away into jail and prison, and putting themselves, their own health and their children's health at risk, when in fact the drug use itself wasn't placing either of them at risk. And so this is a way in which Black women are directly targeted in the context of the war on drugs. Black women are also directly targeted as perceived vessels of drugs that are consumed or concealed, as in the case of Frankie Perkins, but also in the case of so many Black women, as you may have heard, who are stopped at airports and other entry points at the border coming into the country to be strip searched, to be cavity searched, to be forced to take laxatives, to be surveilled as they, as food moves through their system in order to detect whether they are taking drugs. Many of you may have heard of this phenomenon, or whether they're carrying drugs or importing drugs. Many of you may have heard of this phenomenon in the 80s. Please know that it continues unabated at the nation's airports and on the nation's highways and in the nation's homes and communities. Sharnita Corley is a 21-year-old Black woman who was driving to the store to get her mother some medication, or her grandmother some medication. She rolled allegedly through a stop sign, which everyone, I'm sure, who drives a car has done at least once in their life. An officer stopped her, claimed that he smelled marijuana in her car, called a female officer to the scene. And what you see on the right-hand side is a still from dash cam video showing Sharnita Corley being forced to the ground, her legs forced apart, and being forcibly subjected to a cavity search for 11 minutes in full public view. That is a form of sexual violence by law enforcement officers, state-sanctioned sexual violence. It's also one of the ways that the war on drugs is waged on the bodies of Black women and girls across the country every single day. So please see and hear Breonna and Tarika and Alberta's cases within this larger context of what the war on drugs looks like for Black women, girls, and trans people in this country, and of our demands to end the war on drugs as a means of ending this form of violence. Diane Bond also experienced similar forms of sexual violence in her own home by officers who were not only waging the war on drugs, but also waging a war of gentrification to push her out of public housing that they wanted to tear down to build, higher income housing in the area. She was subjected also to forcible strip searches and very demeaning and degrading treatment by police officers repeatedly over and over again in her own home, in addition to physical violence and verbal abuse. And many folks in Louisville, and particularly the Black Lives Matter Louisville chapter, are also making connections between Breonna Taylor's experience and gentrification in her neighborhood. So wanted to also highlight the context of, fatal violence, physical violence, sexual violence in the context of the war on drugs, but also in the context of gentrification and economic development in low-income Black communities that does not benefit Black residents of those communities, like Diane Bond. Sexual violence is something that you may not hear about during this commission of inquiry focused on fatal violence, but I wanted to emphasize that when we expand the frame of the violence that we understand to be police violence that requires our action to include sexual violence by law enforcement officers, which, as I'm sure esteemed members of the tribunal are aware, constitutes torture under international law, then we start to see many, many, many more Black women's experiences come into view, certainly led by the 8 Black women and girls whose rape and sexual violence by Daniel Holsclaw, and the 13 Black women and girls whose rape and sexual violence by Daniel Holsclaw led to him being brought to trial, the 8 on whose allegations he was convicted and sentenced to 263 years in prison. Now, that may give you the illusion that when sexual violence takes place against Black women and girls by police officers, that justice is swift and sure and maybe even extreme. But the fact is that this is a widespread problem that has not come to the forefront in the conversations around #MeToo and sexual violence in the United States, but is a significant portion of the sexual violence that Black women and girls experience and trans people experience on a daily basis in the United States, and is one that takes place not only at the hands of police, but at the hands of prison staff and medical staff and foster care families and social services staff in every, certainly educational staff in every institution in the United States. Black women and girls not only experience some of that, and trans people experience not only some of the highest levels of sexual violence in communities, but also highest levels of sexual violence at the hands of state actors. And what we know is, when it comes to police, that sexual violence is the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force, but not the second most frequently talked about. That an officer is caught in an act of sexual misconduct every 5 days on average, and that data is based on 10 years of credible instances of sexual violence by law enforcement officers. A quarter of those cases involve minors, people under the age of 18. And that law enforcement themselves acknowledge that sexual violence by law enforcement officers, again, defined as torture under international law, is widespread, pervasive, condoned, unaddressed, and constitutes essentially law enforcement's dirty little secret. We know that officers target people who will not likely, who they think will not likely be believed if they come forward, including Black women and girls, Black migrants, Black trans people, Black trans youth, Black women and people who are perceived to be involved in the drug or sex trades, homeless and low-income people, and disabled people. And that sexual violence by law enforcement takes place in the context of traffic stops, so much so that some have coined the term driving while female, and Black youth engagement programs. So when the solutions offered to police violence are, let's create more trust between Black communities and police, let's have more youth programs. Those youth programs in some studies have been shown to be sites for up to 1/3 of the sexual violence that is reported by law enforcement officers. Certainly schools are another site of sexual violence by police, the policing of prostitution-related offenses, as is the case globally, and drug law enforcement, another reason to end the war on drugs in the United States. The penalties are so high and the consequences so many and so diverse, from losing your home to your family, to your children, to your job, to your license, to your student loans, to your access to education and employment, that police officers easily say, look, I could charge you with something that could get you 25 years to life. It could separate you from your children. It could have all these other consequences for you. What are you going to do for me? And they extort sex based on the ways in which the war on drugs is waged in the United States. And then what people call broken windows policing or public order offenses, which definitely were the basis, along with the war on drugs, for Daniel Holsclaw's approach of the women he sexually assaulted and abused and extorted. So, and the last place that people often don't think about, but that every single study of police sexual violence has found, is that police also target survivors of violence themselves. They target people when they respond to domestic violence calls. They target people who come to report sexual violence to them. They target people who they're allegedly assisting for being publicly intoxicated or otherwise in need of care. And this is Tiawanda Moore, a Black woman who called police because her boyfriend was beating her in her home. And instead, when the police separated the two to get their stories, the officer who took Tijuana into her bedroom instead sexually assaulted her and propositioned her. And when she came forward to report this, not only did Internal Affairs dissuade her from doing so, which she recorded them doing, when they discovered that they had been recorded dissuading her from filing this complaint and making all kinds of allegations about her own morality, they charged her with illegal wiretapping. And she stood trial for that charge, which carried a maximum penalty of 15 years in prison for 2 years until she was acquitted, sending a very clear message to survivors of police sexual violence, which is that if they come forward and report sexual violence by law enforcement officers, they are the ones who will be on trial, not the officers who abuse them, which drives this problem further underground, making the data that we do have, as every single researcher who looks into this topic has concluded, to be simply the tip of the iceberg. And finally, beyond fatal violence, there's physical violence that has fatal consequences. This is Brianna B.B. Hill, a Black trans woman who, as you'll see in the bottom right, was brutally beaten and violated by police officers in a nail salon or outside a nail salon, where there was a dispute around her gender identity and her ability to access the nail salon, which police officers were called to respond to. And this is how they responded, with very public, brutal, degrading violence against Brianna, who had done nothing wrong. And a few days later, Brianna turned up dead. And I lay that death squarely at the hands of these two officers, because in their treatment of her, they displayed to the community what appropriate treatment according to them of trans women is. And they made it clear that they would not protect her, and they made it clear that violence against her was condoned by the state. And in that sense, the community then acts on those messages they get from law enforcement, and that contributes to the epidemic of murders of Black trans women in this country, is the degree of police violence and degradation and failure to protect that they experience. That was also true for Dwana Johnson, who, in the context of broken windows policing, was arrested for prostitution, simply walking down the street in Memphis, Tennessee, her hometown, at 1 a.m. There was no money exchange. There was no other person around. There was no agreement to have any sex. There was simply a Black woman literally walking while transgender in her town, and was arrested for trading sex, taken to the police precinct, and brutally beaten and pepper sprayed by 2 officers on camera. You can Google and find this video of it anywhere on the internet. And unfortunately, unlike in Rodney King's case, that video did not produce national outrage. It did not produce a national uprising. It did not produce even outrage among mainstream civil rights organizations in Memphis, where she lived. And people asked the mainstream civil rights organizations why that was. And they said, while we don't condone what happened to Dwana, we also don't condone who she is as a person, as a Black trans person. They said it in much less respectful terms than that. And that is another way in which Black trans, what I should say is that Dwana Johnson was later found dead, killed by a bullet to the back of her head, execution style. And that many people believe police were involved in that killing, because she took the video, took it nationwide, filed a civil suit, got the Department of Justice involved in investigating her beating by the officers. But unfortunately, they weren't able to prevent her killing. And in fact, the widespread video of that beating, in my opinion, also signaled to people what kind of treatment the state will condone and facilitate and perpetrate against Black trans women, and contributed to her death as well. The physical violence that Black women and girls and trans people experience at the hands of law enforcement officers start as early as the age of 5. This is only one of many videos of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, Black girls being arrested and handcuffed and abused by police officers in schools. Many of you, I'm sure, saw the assault at Spring Valley High, where a young woman was pulled out of her chair by a police officer stationed in her school and dragged across the floor forcefully. The physical violence against Black women and girls also happens when they're pregnant. Roseanne Miller was put in a chokehold also by a police officer when 5 months pregnant. The police officer was enforcing broken windows rules against barbecuing in public. As you can see, she's inside the gate of her own home, but the officer was trying to stop her from barbecuing on her own property and enforce that order with a chokehold. Raven Dozier was, or is, a Black woman who was pregnant at the time that her brother was being arrested in her home. And when she protested the fact that the officers were tasing him, even though he was on the ground and handcuffed and putting up no resistance, an officer in DeKalb County in Atlanta, which has been very much in the news lately, thanks to the Senate race, called back and kicked her with the full force of a kick intended to take down a door in her pregnant belly as a response. Her baby was born healthy but early because it had experienced injuries from that attack. Similarly, Nicola Robinson was standing on her stoop in the south side of Chicago when an officer ran by chasing someone for reasons she had no idea. The officer was unable to catch that person, and so she laughed, as many of us might do, and the officer came back and punched her hard where she's pointing on her very pregnant, 8-month pregnant belly, saying, "You Black bitch, you're lucky I don't kill your fucking baby." That's the kind of police violence that Black pregnant people experience in the United States out of not only obviously anti-Blackness, but a very deep anti-Black womanhood, what scholar Moya Bailey has called misogynoir, which also targets Black women's reproductive capacity and Black women's capacity as pregnant people and parents. Many of you may have heard of Jasmine Headley, who was violently arrested and separated from her child in a public benefits office where she was waiting for a child care voucher so she could continue to work and take care of her child, and had decided to sit on the floor because there were no chairs available. And when an officer told her she couldn't do that, this is what ensued. Police physical violence against Black women also extends to grandmothers like Denise Stewart, who was in her home when officers claiming to be investigating a child welfare issue barged in, ripped her out into her hallway half naked because she had just taken a shower and was at the door in a towel, and said she wasn't letting them in because she was just coming out of the shower and she had no idea what they were there for. Turns out they were at the wrong apartment, but that all ensued with her being pulled naked into the hallway in front of her neighbors and family as a grandmother, and violated and denigrated in front of people in her community. Police physical violence happens against teachers. This is Breonna King, Breon King, who experienced this physical violence after a traffic stop and was told that the violence that Black people experience from police officers is our fault because of the ways in which we quote unquote behave. Black disabled people also targeted for physical violence by police. In terms of fatal violence, 1/2 to 1/3 of people killed by police are or are perceived to be in a mental health crisis or in some way disabled at the time that they're killed. Thankfully, LaShawn White was not one of the people who was killed, but she was someone who was experiencing violence in her home, called police, told the dispatcher she needed ASL interpretation. When police arrived, she did what the dispatcher told her to do, which was to run from her house towards the police to safety. And instead, the police tackled her to the ground, yelled at her, and her neighbors yelled back that she couldn't communicate because she was deaf and that she needed an interpreter, and they beat her instead. So this kind of physical violence is pervasive in all kinds of contexts: street stops, calls for help, traffic stops, all the places that police interact with Black women and girls and trans people. And so I just also want to place these incidents in a larger context, which is that Black women and girls and trans people are the fastest growing prison and jail populations in the United States. That Black women, that the number of women in prison has increased by 700% over the past 4 decades. The number of people in women's jails and local facilities has increased by twice that much, by 1,400% in the past 4 decades. And that the populations of people in prisons for women continue to rise, even as those populations of people in prisons for men fall because of the reforms that people have been engaged in. Certainly, we haven't talked much about in the popular discourse about how the proportion of people incarcerated in women's prison is largely queer, is people identify as lesbian and bisexual before incarceration. 33% of folks in women's prisons identify as such, and if we add trans people, that number increases to 42%. Black disabled people are disproportionately incarcerated, and almost half of people in women's jails and a third of people in women's prisons have one form of disability or another. And all of these figures involve disproportionately Black women, because Black women continue to be incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. And almost 1 in 2 Black trans women experience incarceration in their lifetime. So many of you no doubt have heard the statistic that Black men, 1 in 3 Black men will experience incarceration in their lifetime in the United States. That statistic has galvanized a movement against mass incarceration, rightly so. The statistic that 1 in 2 Black trans women experiences incarceration in her lifetime should also equally galvanize our movements and to end mass incarceration and the policing that produces it. Many of you may know that nearly 80% of women in jails are mothers, most of them of minor children, most of them convicted of minor offenses. And the reason I highlight those figures, even though we're talking about police today, is because all of those figures are the product of police encounters, that people don't just show up in jail or prisons or immigration detention centers. Someone puts them there, and that most often starts with an encounter with police, and that those encounters with police certainly can be fatal, and a person may never make it to a jail cell, but also can involve all of the violence that we have just been talking about, and the violence of conviction and incarceration. So women's arrests continue to rise as men's fall, and Black women particularly are disproportionately stopped and arrested compared to white women across the country, and Latinas across the country. That as arrests of men are dropping, arrests of Black women are increasing particularly, and that Black women are arrested 3 times as often as white women and twice as often as Latinas following police stops. And that is happening predominantly in the context of the war on drugs, as well as public order and broken windows and crimes of poverty. And each of those offenses and increase in arrests creates another opportunity for police violence against Black women, queer and trans people, and girls. So broken windows, arrests and contacts are going up. And so what you may hear about in the context, say, of Marley Graham's case, is how stop and frisk in New York City contributed to violent, fatal, and criminalizing encounters for so many young Black men like Marley, and so many lost their lives to it also. And what you may not hear is that the racial disparities in the stops and frisks in New York City were identical among women as they were among men. And that in Chicago, for instance, where Rakia was killed, while young Black men are most likely to be stopped in car stops or pedestrian stops, young Black women are close behind them, and in the case of car stops, are more likely to be stopped than men. And that these stops carry particular consequences in addition to the ones I've talked about: physical violence, sexual violence, the likelihood of fatal violence. Sandra Bland, for instance, is a prime example of a stop that turned deadly, violent and deadly. And there's also the ways in which Black women are sexually harassed, sexualized, humiliated, and degraded in very gendered ways in the context of those stops. And that these forms of degradation and humiliation also make Black women more vulnerable to community-based violence. So for instance, Ashanti Galloway was subjected to a stop and frisk, her purse dumped on the sidewalk. She had just done a double shift at the hospital, so she had extra underwear, and she maybe had a diaphragm and a few other things in her bag. And the officers pulled those up and displayed them to everyone in the corner and mocked her and talked about them, and then dropped it and left it all there. And the message that sends to the people around her in that moment is that she will not only not be protected, she'll be violated by police. And that puts her at greater danger of community-based violence in addition to the police violence she just experienced. What also happens in the context of those searches is actual policing of gender, or those stops, traffic stops or street stops, is actual policing of gender binaries among Black people. So literally a police officer saying, what gender is on your ID? That doesn't match the gender I think that you're presenting or that you are presenting, and therefore I'm now going to subject you to some form of deeper scrutiny, violence, and interrogation, and potentially sexual or physical violence. That's what happened to Juan Evans, a Black trans man who was stopped in a traffic stop, presented his ID, and was threatened with a strip search and cavity search by the side of the road by the officers involved. Stops of homeless women involve violence of the kind that Marlene Pinnock experienced by the side of the road in Los Angeles. They involve profiling as well for alleged involvement in the sex trades or in lewd conduct. 80% of people who are arrested for the offense of loitering for the purposes of prostitution, which basically means standing on a corner, and a cop believes that you're doing that for the purpose of trading sex for something of value. Of course, a cop can't know what you're thinking when you're standing on a corner, but there are very deeply held racialized perceptions of Black women and trans people that date back to slavery in this country that I don't need to tell any of you about, that inform how officers perceive Black women standing on a corner and the ways in which they're then profiled. Extorted for sex also in the context of prostitution policing, because like drug offenses, prostitution offenses carry very broad and deep consequences, from child welfare to losing your home, to losing your job, to losing immigration status. And this creates opportunities for officers to extort sex from people in the sex trades in exchange for promises of leniency, which often don't materialize. And so this broken windows of policing in the context of policing of prostitution-related offenses is also a prime site of physical violence and sexual violence against Black women and girls, and also trans people who have documented in Atlanta and other places that the most dangerous thing that they experience, including if they're involved in the sex trades or homeless or experiencing violence in their community, the most dangerous thing that they experience, in fact, is police and policing. And lastly, in the context of the current coronavirus pandemic and the policing of public health orders that has ensued, as opposed to and instead of providing people with protection and supports to stay home, to survive the pandemic, to receive appropriate medical care and income support and accurate public health information and so on, that has, as many of you I'm sure have tracked, led to racial disparities and violence in enforcement of public health orders that tracks all of the patterns I just discussed. So racial disparities, certainly according to race and who is experiencing all forms of enforcement, from ticketing to harassment to arrest and conviction, but particularly that Black women, again, are experiencing the highest rates of racial disparities. They're 5 times more likely than white women to be in some way subject to enforcement of public health orders, even though Black women are literally saving our lives as healthcare workers, as essential workers, as service workers, and as essential workers, and also experiencing the kinds of violent policing that accompanies enforcement of public health orders in the United States. Many of you may have witnessed the treatment of Kayla Moore, a young mother who was harassed by officers for the way that she was wearing her mask while she was making a phone call on the subway in New York City, tackled to the ground violently in front of her 5-year-old child. That's just one example of how this kind of enforcement is happening across the country. So what is the response? The response is to end the war on Black women, both in our communities and by the state, and end the war on Black trans and gender nonconforming people and on Black girls by the state at the hands of police. And so when you hear demands to defund the police, to fund communities, to invest in genuine and lasting and sustainable and real community safety for all members of our communities, what you're hearing are survivors like myself and many others of both community violence and police violence saying we want more and better for all of us and for all Black women, including Black women like Breonna Taylor. We want a world where Breonna Taylor could live, and all the women whose stories you've heard today, and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people whose stories you've heard today or that you won't hear and don't hear we want to build a world where those stories haven't happened, where all the people who I've told you about who have been killed could be alive, and where we can end the war on Black women and end the war on Black, trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and intersex people. And for more information on how we're calling on people to do that, I'm going to direct you to the Movement for Black Lives, Vision for Black Lives, demands to end the war on Black women and end the war on Black, trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex people, available at m4bl.org/policy, m4bl.org/policy. Thank you so much for your time today and attention. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share these stories, these perspectives, and these contexts with all of you. And I am grateful for the Commission's existence and for your service on it. Thank you.